Our next speaker turns our attention away from other business history organizations and towards the state of business history in Canada. For this presentation, we're lucky to have Professor Douglas McCalla with us today. Professor Doug McCalla, if you don't know him, is one of the leading pioneering experts in Canadian business history. A very long and distinguished career that includes being a Canadian CRC, a Canada Research Chair in rural business history, and being appointed a university professor at the University of Guelph. He has many publications, books and articles, and a diverse group of publications. And he happens to be a scholar who was at Trent. Before I came to Trent, we never overlapped, but I've always seen him as something of a kind of a mentor in terms of the kind of output and contributions that he has made in the past, not just to the Canadian historical profession, but also specifically to business history. We'd like to welcome Professor Doug McCalla today to talk about the state of business history in Canada.
Well, thanks, Dimitri. That's quite flattering, and I was flattered to be asked to speak today. But I do need to start with a caveat, which is that I've been retired for years. And before that, although I was working in business records, my research was increasingly at a tangent to business history. So I'm no longer on top of the field, if I ever really was. In other words, you probably know as much as I do about the current state of Canadian business history. But I agreed to talk about the subject anyway because I wanted the chance to welcome this association. It was an opportunity I couldn't pass up, to be able to pass on my hopes for the organization. Particularly, I hope that it will encourage the breadth of work that earlier Canadian efforts in business history, particularly several business history conferences that I was involved in, were seeking to achieve. Those conferences involved participants with varied perspectives, and they fostered conversations and debates about the scope of the field, about approaches, and even about which were the important specific stories and how to tell those stories in particular. That was very much the case at the first Canadian Business History Conference, which was held at Trent in 1984. There were 120 people there, and they came from corporations with a sense of the importance of their own past, and some also a sense of the importance of business in the Canadian past. It was encouraging to find corporations that took that broader view, as well as a view that their own individual histories were significant. There were faculty from faculties of management and law. There were archivists. There were public historians. There were historically oriented social scientists. And there were quite a few historians from history departments, and that's where my main identification was. So if I lean a little more heavily in that direction of what I say today, please forgive me. Well, I'm not sure, given the competition for scholarly time and attention these days, whether it would be as easy to attract that diverse a group today. It seems from the membership report that you're doing pretty well, but it's probably a greater challenge to get that full breadth of interests gathered together in one place at one time, given all of the other pressures on scholarly time and attention. But I hope this association can work at that where it's appropriate, and that it can be, as it were, a broad church and not a sect. Well, I don't think it's necessary to argue the value of a Canadian association to you. You're here. But I think outside this room, it might be a little more necessary to do so. And that's because anyone in Canada who works on enterprise elsewhere in the world will already be well connected to the networks and associations that pursue research on those parts of the world that interest them. So it seems to me important to do as is clearly being attempted here, to draw upon the interest of people who do not actually do research on Canada as part of the larger work of the association. One way is, as with the conference coming up later this week, which involves a theme that's much wider than parochial Canadian interest. And I think Canadians who work on Canadian history know the importance of being connected to a wider literature and to those who work on other parts of the world as well. And what I would like to hope, and here I ignore my experience and I speak with optimism, I'd like to imagine the possibility of two-way exchanges, that is, that the world might sometimes learn from Canadian experience as well. And it's a good deal harder for Canadians to get the world's attention than vice versa, but I think it's worth making the effort. Well, that's all pretty sincere and pretty general and pretty pious, and I think I'd like for the rest of my time to be a little more specific. I would say something about archives, except I don't need to because that's going to be covered separately. I don't know if any of you, probably a few here at least, will recall Canadian Papers in Business History, a promising venture that ended after just 2 volumes. The set of Canadian business history conferences that began at Trent in 1984 lasted longer, but as far as I know, the last one was the lively and successful 6th meeting, which was held at Trois-Rivières in 2002. I'm aware of some specialized workshops since, but I'm not aware of a general Canadian business history conference since Trois-Rivières in 2002. That those ventures ran out of momentum, or maybe that is they ran out of willing organizers to carry them forward, or maybe they ran out of a ready supply of funds to keep them going forward, could be read as indicating that there are challenges in institutionalizing and sustaining the work of business history as the initial directors give way to their replacements. The replacement process is a pretty important part of sustaining an organization. For sure, you're off to a good start in creating a formal organization. There never was one for this series of conferences. They simply were, it was a kind of baton was passed from one block to another. Well, our decision to organize conferences reflected something of a boom in books in Canadian business history in the 1970s and early 80s. One of them was a book by Tom Naylor called The History of Canadian Business. But unlike almost all the others from that period, it's still in print with a major academic press. Well, I don't know if it sells, and I mention it because of the claims made for it by its publisher. They say, quote, that it was chosen by the Social Science Federation of Canada as one of the 20 most outstanding works in the field, and that field is social science, not just history, in the second half of the 20th century. And the publishers say it was an unprecedented work in Canadian historiography. Well, it was, of course, far from being unprecedented, since it was essentially a reworking of an argument published early in the first half of the 20th century, Gustavus Meyer's muckraking History of Canadian Wealth. That there were influential people in the Canadian historical and social science communities who thought so highly of Naylor's work reflects a view of business that's still current in some circles in Canada. It's a view I also meet in my the field of my later scholarly years, rural history, where belief in the moral economy model is deeply held. And that model idealizes rural society as an Arcadian world of mutuality in which capitalism and business are from outside. In the graphic sexual language of many accounts, capitalism penetrated rural communities that resisted but could not escape. Well, I've argued with people about these things for quite a while, and I've given up any hope of changing the minds of people who have these simplistically critical views of business. It just seems to me what the point of mentioning them is to say there's a really serious case to provide countervailing business histories that actually do address the realities and the complexities of the business past, even if the true believers and other views don't ever read them, the rest of Canada and the rest of the world does need them anyway. Well, happily, there's quite a lot of work on the credit side of the ledger, if I can put it that way. It's encouraging, for example, that 3 of the first 4 winners of the Canadian Historical Association's highest academic honor, the Garneau Medal, were books that took business history very seriously, that business was central to those 3 of the first 4 winners of the Garneau Medal. But it's also significant that the authors of those medal-winning books, Louise Deschênes, Michael Bliss, and Joy Parr, all moved on to other fields of research. They did not stay in business history. And the point, really the main point for what I have to say today, is that they were not alone. I looked at the publications that came from the early business history conferences, and of the 25 authors who appeared in the first 3 sets of publications, there were many who would never have considered themselves specialists in business history, but even of those who did, only 1 or 2 stayed in the field, the most notable being Graham Taylor, whose work I'll come back to in a minute. Another indication of discontinuity is that hardly anyone attending the Trois-Rivières Conference in 2002 had been at Trent in 1984, so there's substantial turnover in the field. My notes from Trois-Rivières remind me that there were 2 people, myself and 1 other, maybe Steve, I'm not sure, who attended all 6 of those conferences. Okay, so maybe not in this room then. I didn't write down who else it was, but there were all 2 of us who actually got to all 6 Canadian business history conferences. Well, in effect, Deschênes, Bliss, Joy Parr, and all those others, what I'll call for today my generation of historians, including many who recognize that understanding Canadian history of any kind required careful consideration of economic forces and business institutions. And they've left a really substantial legacy that can serve current business historians well. There's a lot of literature that can be drawn on. I think of this work as having pushed back powerful abstractions that often served as substitutes for business history and Canadian historical writing. Still, a lot of old generalizations are still embedded in the textbooks. And there's much we don't know, including, of course, the unknown unknowns that only new research will discover. For what we do know, an excellent starting point is the extensive footnotes to Graham Taylor and Peter Baskerville's 500-page, I stress the length, concise history of concise business history of Canada, which was published more than 20 years ago. It's a compliment, not a criticism, to Taylor and Baskerville that they did not intend their book as the last word on the subject. In shaping their story, they provided many explicit leads to further work, provided often alternative ways of seeing particular episodes, and more generally, they produced a work that invited others to engage with its themes and ideas. So there's actually a pretty good foundation there. Well, Graham's not here today, so I could take his name a bit in vain, but it's not really in vain at all. He's since written another book, The Rise of Canadian Business, published in 2009. And I thought of taking it as representative. I have no reason to doubt that it's representative. And I thought I could use it to end with 2 points about the recent state of specifically Canadian business history. The first one is that, as he notes very explicitly, his account of the century after 1885 is drawn almost entirely from the 1994 book. That only very modest adjustments were enough to incorporate all the intervening research on the period is a suggestion that maybe there's not all that much intervening research between 1994 and 2009. Well, the second conclusion from that book is that Taylor decided to compress much of the rise of business in Canada, the entire period to 1885, into one chapter of less than 20 pages. And it's discouraging, and that's a pattern, by the way, that can be found more widely in Canadian historiography. With the significant exception of the history of Indigenous peoples, pre-Confederation Canada has been disappearing from the research agenda. It's just fading away. Since that's the field I've mainly worked in, that's sort of cri de coeur when I mention that. But one consequence of that disappearance is that the interpretive complexities of modern research have also been fading into the background. When they are stripped away, what's left, certainly what's left in Taylor's book, and what's left in popular understanding, is a story of several centuries of business history and of economic history that would be utterly and entirely familiar to the pioneers of our discipline writing before 1940, There's nothing in the first chapter of The Rise of Canadian Business that Arthur Lower and Harold Innes and W.A. McIntosh wouldn't recognize immediately. And surely we've learned something in the 75 or 80 years since. But I think that's a function of shrinking and shrinking and shrinking the coverage pre-Confederation period. All the complexities disappear, and what remains is the foundation myth and not much else. Well, in a recent essay, the distinguished American historian Naomi Lamoureux has written of a new wave of historians interested in the history of American capitalism, and she lists a whole bunch of books. Well, the gist of my argument this afternoon is that I'm not aware of such a wave in the writing of Canadian business history in the same period. On the other hand, I believe it would be great if such a wave could be made, even a tsunami if you're really up to it. And I very much hope that the Canadian Business History Association is going to do exactly that. Thanks very much.